Magandang gabi po sa inyong lahat. Good evening, everyone. How's everyone doing today? A little more. How's everyone doing? Second impression. I'm so honored to be speaking to you all today, especially as myself. I am currently the House Representative coming from Anchorage, representing the neighborhoods of Airport Heights, Mountain View, Russian Jack. Anybody ever lived in Airport Heights, Mountain View, or Russian Jack?
Yep.
Yeah, I love that. I love my district. And one of the reasons why I'm really honored to represent my area, not only because of the fact that I was born there and I was raised there, but it really is one of the most diverse areas in the entire United States of America. When I was elected back in 2022, I became the second Filipino American elected to the Alaska legislature, and it's truly a privilege to be able to represent not only my district, but also my family, my ancestors, and everybody back home from the Philippines. And so what I'm going to talk about is the story of Filipino American History Month, the bill that I carried and passed unanimously into law, why it's important and why it is so integral that we celebrate this month in Alaska and to celebrate our communities. Next slide, please. Wonderful. If folks don't recognize who this individual is, this is Jose Rizal. He is the national hero of the Philippines. And a quote that he has that is really important for many Filipino Americans and Filipinos around this world is this concept of no history, no self. And inversely, no history means no self. Our history and understanding where we come from and how we got to where we are today is so important to our own sense of identity. But for myself, growing up as a Filipino American in Alaska, I didn't really grow up with a strong sense of a Filipino identity. My family emigrated from the Philippines in the late 80s and the early 90s. I'm the only one in my family born in Alaska. I didn't grow up Catholic. I didn't grow up knowing the language. I didn't do the cultural dances. And I felt really disconnected from a lot of the Filipino American community. But really, learning about Filipino American history as an adult helped me better understand who I was. And it is so important that we integrate this concept of history, not just in the way that we learn about United States history or Alaska history in our schools, but to really celebrate a history that reflects all of our communities. I, for one, love Alaska history. I love learning about American history, but I never learned about Filipino Americans growing up at all. And so I want to take a step back and talk about this Filipino American history that we have. Next slide, please. Filipino contributions to the United States. We know that there are Filipino Americans in our community. We think commonly, custodians, nurses, etc. But there are many major contributions of Filipino Americans to our country. In World War II, over 250,000 Filipinos served in the United States Army Forces in the Far East under General Douglas MacArthur. This is when the Philippines was under the American rule and when the Empire of Japan invaded the Philippines. I didn't really know how my family got to America. I knew that my dad was in California, and I only learned the details of why my family is here. It is because my dad's uncle fought as one of those 250,000 Filipinos and was granted citizenship to America. Moving on to Larry Itliong. Larry Itliong is one of the most prominent labor organizers in the United States. If anyone remembers or has heard of the 1965 grape strike, it was when union workers in California went on strike and boycotted the working conditions and the wages that they have. Many people know of the name Cesar Chavez, but not a lot of people know of the name Larry Itliong, who was leading the Filipino union workers at the same time as Cesar Chavez was leading the Latino farm workers. And it was the Filipino union workers that started that strike in the first place. My dad, 10, 15 years later, would also become one of those great farm workers who was part of the many Ilocanos and Manongs that were working in California. And additionally, Larry and Leong actually worked in Alaska. There's a long history of Filipinos who are working in agricultural farms in the western US that come up to Alaska seasonally. And then, moving on to why we have so many Filipino nurses. Well, Filipinos were trained to be nurses during World War II, and when there was a nurse shortage in the 50s, many of those nurses came to America because the United States opened up many of their immigration rules surrounding nurses and healthcare workers. My mother became one of those nurses in the 80s and 90s who emigrated to America. And so here I was, a person who literally came from many of these Filipino contributions to the United States. But I had no idea of the history of why my family came here. Next slide, please. So now talking about Filipinos in Alaska, I mentioned earlier about the history of Filipinos coming up to Alaska as cannery workers, working in fish processing plants, and those individuals are known as Alaskeros. Now, since 1788, Filipinos have been in Alaska. The earliest record of Filipinos being in Alaska were Filipino seamen on Spaniard ships that went over to Alaska. And not only have we have been working in cannery plants, but also up in the Arctic. Filipinos were welcomed into whaling ships in Ukqiagvik. In Southeast Alaska in the 1900s and in the 20th century, when Tlinkits were experiencing a lot of racial discrimination, Filipinos also experienced that discrimination and solidarity, and you see many of those Tlingit Filipino families in Southeast Alaska. And moreover, Filipinos are here in many of our military bases, such as here in the interior, and in Anchorage. We are so prominent in this state. We're the largest immigrant group, but we're not reflected in many of our history books or in other positions of power, such as in government, etc. And the most important thing for me, and this is moving on to the next slide here, is then talking about Filipino American History Month. In 1992, the Filipino American Historical Society recognized Filipino American History Month in October to celebrate our Filipino American history. And I just want to note that the Filipino American Historical Society, one of the founders of that group was Representative Thelma Buckle. She was the first Filipina American elected to any state legislature in the nation, and she is such a role model for me. And she wrote this book, Filipinos in Alaska, to document the history of Filipino Americans in our state. There has been more movements to now recognize Filipino American History Month in Congress, in California, the Hawaii state legislatures, and I'm really proud of the fact that last year I helped carry the bill to officially recognize Filipino American History Month in Alaska law. And that passed. One thing that I think is really important to note is that there are some of these bills that are recognizing different cultural communities and all of that. And when I carried this bill, I made sure to talk to every single office, no matter where they were at on different political issues. I wanted to make sure that I could speak to everyone and know about their experiences with the Filipino community. And the fact that everybody supported that piece of legislation shows the impact that Filipino Americans have had not only in Alaska, but in our histories, in our families, and in the workplaces that we organize in the households that people grow up in, how we share food with each other. there has been such a positive impression of Filipino Americans within our state, and it's so important to celebrate Filipino American History Month. So I want to go through just a few photos just to showcase some of the celebrations that we had of Filipino American History Month last year, which was the first official Filipino American History Month. Next slide, please. Last year, I traveled to a few different communities across the state, one being Filcom over in Juneau, Alaska. They are one of the oldest Filipino communities in the state. It's between them and Ketchikan. I don't know which one is oldest, if they're in a competition, so we need to do more history on that part. But it was so disheartening to hear about the stories of Filipino Americans who were involved in Filcom, especially those of the Filipino Tlingit families that felt a lot of discrimination, but also bonded together in solidarity to support each other's communities. And I think that feeling of solidarity is such an important value that I really hold in such importance as a Filipino. Moving on to the next slide. I also traveled over to Ketchikan. They have a wonderful Filipino community out over there. They also have a lumpia eating competition, and I just want to pitch this very quickly. I've been to a couple of different Filipino American History Month events in Fairbanks, Matsu, Juneau. If we could all hold a lumpia eating competition, and then we have like lumpia regionals, and then lumpia state, just think about it. I think there's a lot of potential there. Next slide, please. And finally, one of the biggest events that happened last year was an event held by an organization called Mana. Mana is a collective of young Filipino Americans that are about my age, who are creatives, who are involved in storytelling. And there are many Filipino Americans who are around my age group who often feel disconnected from the older organizations that may do a lot of the cultural dances and the potlucks, but for a lot of us, we're still trying to figure out what our place is in the community. And so it was really great to see so many young people come together to share the stories of our elders that had never been told before. And that's the impact of celebrating our history, because to know history is to know self. And to know history is also telling our history of our families, and to let our families know that they can share their own stories of themselves, that those stories are valuable to us because their stories help us understand who we are. This is a sentiment that's really important, not just for me and for myself growing up, but also for the broader Filipino American community and the broader Asian American Pacific Islander community. Asian American Pacific Islanders have one of the highest rates of depression and suicide ideation, which is an issue that's very important for me. And so much of this feeling of lack of self-worth is because of this feeling of a lack of identity. When we tell our stories and when we celebrate our history, we're understanding not only ourselves, but also how we relate to one another. And for myself, as a Philam in Anchorage, I had no idea the Philams that are in Fairbanks or in Juneau. And my mom all the time asked me, oh, are there Philams in Juneau? Yes, there are. They're everywhere, right? And so when we celebrate Filipino American History Month, we also take this opportunity to connect with our Filipino communities in different parts of Alaska, which is so special to me. And over here on the right-hand side is myself with Titania Buckold, Tamo Buckold's daughter. And I just really want to pinpoint just the importance of history and of representation. I didn't see myself as a Filipino really when I got started to get involved in politics and in government until I started to look up Filipinos in government and I learned about Tama Buckold. And it was that turning point to me where I not only started to understand what it meant to be a Filipino in a space where I didn't see Filipinos, but to truly be proud of it being Filipino. Additionally, understanding where I come from made me understand the responsibility that I have to not only uplift my community, but also to make sure that our community is uplifting one another in this state. I want to thank you all for being here today to celebrate Filipino American History Month. And the month is just the first step. There's so many opportunities to learn about our culture and one another. Thank you so much. Maraming salamat po.
Let's give her another round of applause. Thank you for all that you do. Wow, that was amazing. I love hearing all the history that we have here.